Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to LSU Science Café. I'm Steve Beck with the Office of Research and Economic Development, and we're excited to bring you tonight's program featuring research by LSU faculty. Despite our physical distance, our goal is to build a strong, informed community by providing access to reliable information, new ideas, and cutting-edge research, scholarship, and creativity from LSU faculty experts in fields across the university. Tonight's event is brought to you in partnership with the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs at LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication and local public radio station, WRKF. WRKF will be giving away one stainless steel NPR Science Friday beverage tumbler to one lucky audience member tonight. To enter the drawing, click on the link in the chat box and fill out the Google form with your contact information. Also, please be aware that this online event is being recorded. It will be available with a transcription from the LSU Research website within the next few days. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's program and speakers who will present some of their research pertaining to the current climate on race and the pandemic. And I'd like to ask them to turn on their video so people can see them, and we can get started from there. Excellent. So there is no doubt that these are challenging times. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. Against this backdrop, the killing of George Floyd and other Black people by police has brought to the forefront the persistence of racism in our country and our society, which has led to massive public outcry and uprisings. To help deepen our understanding, we are joined tonight by Dr. Roland Mitchell, Dr. Lori Martin, and Dr. David Stamps. Dr. Roland Mitchell is the E.B. Ted Robert Endowed Professor and Dean of the College of Human Sciences and Education at LSU. His research theorizes the impact of historical and communal knowledge on post-secondary education. He has authored 7 books and numerous scholarly works that have appeared in leading educational journals. He serves as the director of the Louisiana Summit on African American Male Educational Success, and for his ongoing service at meeting the needs of underrepresented populations in education, he has been awarded the David Kahn Award for Exemplary Service by the Baton Rouge Youth Coalition. He has a deep passion for impactful community service, as evidenced through his membership on the advisory boards of the Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services, Campus Federal Credit Union, and the Louisiana Governor's Task Force on Community Policing and Reform. Dr. Lori Martin is a professor in the African and African American Studies program and the Department of Sociology at LSU. She is also the chair of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Diversity Committee and the LSU Faculty Athletics Council. She is the author of many scholarly works. Her most recent publications include Black Women as Leaders, Big Box Schools, White Sports, Black Sports, and South Baton Rouge. She has a forthcoming book with Brill called Introduction to Africana Demography and a forthcoming book called America in Denial with the State University of New York Press. David Stamps is an assistant professor in strategic communication and mass media and holds the current Joe D. Smith Hibernia Professorship at the LSU Manship School of Mass Communication. His research is aimed at understanding the psychological and behavioral effects of identity-focused interpersonal interactions, individuals' exposure to and engagement with media. Inherent in this work is a recognition that issues of class, gender, race, geographic location, and sexuality meaningfully impact these relationships. His research appears in several published books, including Films as Rhetorical Texts, Cultivating Discussion about Race, Racism, and Race Relations, and in multiple peer-reviewed journals. After their presentations, we'll have a moderated question and answer session. To participate, please use the Q&A button to enter your question. We will be monitoring that section and relaying the questions to our panelists. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dean Roland Mitchell. Dean Mitchell. Dean Mitchell, you need to turn off to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Okay, I am unmuted now. So
Okay.
first I want to start off by saying thank you to Drs. Bentley, to Dr. Beck, Allison, Holly, the entire ORED group for giving us an opportunity to be part of this conversation. To my panel, my co-panel members, in addition to being excited to be part of this conversation, I am a fan of your research. I'm a fan of the work that you do. So thank you for letting me be part of this discussion. Now the work that I want to present today is part of a contribution to a book that's titled The Corona Chronicles. That book will be out later this summer. And so I, along with one of our colleagues in FM, Dr. Herman Kelly, and our colleague at Southern Law School, Dr. Walter T. Tillman Jr., penned a chapter for the book entitled Encouragement in Times of Confinement, Challenging the Honda Narrative Through Historically Black Colleges and the Church. Now, the gist of the article, the gist of the chapter is that as social scientists, we're suspect of this idea that something is new. This is the new. We've never experienced this before. We like to say that once you've actually looked at this contemporary moment and historicized it, that actually there may be ideas and wisdom that resides from past experiences and from communities that have thrived in these instances. And we think in this case, that past wisdom actually resides in the Black church and historically Black colleges and universities. Now, given that this is a brief presentation, I'll focus on the contributions of historically Black colleges and universities. But you'll see one of the ties that binds all of our presentations today is that if you look at Black faith communities, the church, different kind of clubs, networks, there's wisdom that resides in those spaces that's critically important for having this conversation right now. So the first thing that I want to debunk is this idea that this confinement is new, or that somehow confinement is inherently can be a productive time. Now, it's not lost on me that New Orleans, Louisiana, for whatever reason, has historically been recognized as a leader, a global leader in confinement, in particular in confinement of the same bodies that are greatly impacted by the pandemic. But I'd also like to argue that, keep in mind, the Apostle Paul penned a third of the New Testament while he was in prison. Regardless of what you think about your faith commitments, it's worth noting that it's hard to argue that the Christian Bible 2,000 years later hasn't drastically impacted the way that we think about ourselves and guided the world. Also, during World War II, Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci penned the prison notebooks during that time period. Gramsci's concept of hegemony is still a key organizing principle for social theorists and community organizers as they think about responding to oppression. And more germane to our particular moment, this conversation, is King's letter from Birmingham jail. The fact that in that letter, King actually talks about the difference between racial tolerance and what we're describing right now is I'm not just tolerant, but I'm actually anti-racist. We're acting as if that's a new concept, not a new concept. But from a broader perspective, once again, keep in mind, Black folks since 1619 have experienced everything from slavery to Jim Crow, redlining neighborhoods in the 70s, and even in our own community right now, this whole phenomenon of food deserts. So we've experienced confinement, the worst kind of confinement, even in segregation. But also keep in mind, during that confinement, that's where America's indigenous music, blues, that's where it comes from. And for our case, that blues grew into jazz. You can also say that during that confinement, that's what produced the Harlem Renaissance. All those Black folks leaving Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, going to Chicago, and ultimately going to New York, it's that same thing. So I like to say that Black folks didn't just survive confinement, but they actually changed the course of arguably the most powerful country that the world has ever seen during that confinement. So, more closely to Baton Rouge, in the Monday, May 6th, 2020 edition of the Greater Baton Rouge Business Report, editor Stephanie Regal penned an op-ed piece titled An Emerging Narrative About COVID-19 in Baton Rouge. She used the phrase Honda to describe the face of the coronavirus in Baton Rouge. The H in Honda stands for high blood pressure. The O stands for obesity. The N stands for not taking your medication. The D stands for diabetic, and the A stands for African American. What this is it actually describes the characteristics of folks that are most likely to be impacted, hospitalized, and ultimately may very well experience mortality or die. For our presentation, I want to take out two of those words, the N, not taking medication, the D, diabetic, and the A, African American. So look at the map. All that I want you to take away from this one slide is that the very top shows the population of enslaved people or Africans, not yet African Americans, in the 1860s. So keep in mind, the deeper the blue, the higher the concentration. Go down to the next map, that's in 2006. It shows the lower extremity amputations among Medicare beneficiaries. So keep in mind, people that have diabetes, and you see deep blue, the deeper the blue, the higher the rates of diabetes, and then ultimately, that other map, the map at the bottom is from 2020, and it shows the location of historically Black colleges and universities. Now, as you're looking at the map, the question that I want you to think through is, why is it that the virology of a never before encountered disease that has no racial preference conforms to the historic contours of Jim Crow? What's going on there? What's happening there? Now, here's where I want to close, and I want you to work with me here. There was an article entitled "The Black American Amputation Epidemic," which appeared in the May 19th, 2020 edition of ProPublica. It states, despite the great scientific strides in diabetic care, the rates of amputation across the country grew by 50% between 2009 and 2015. Diabetics undergo 130,000 amputations each year, often in low-income and underinsured neighborhoods. Black patients lose limbs at triple the rate of others. So think about it. As far as diabetes, having access to health care impacts whether or not you experience amputation at higher rates. It has nothing to do with science. It's about economics. You know the story. We've heard the exact same thing. In the Black Belt region of Alabama, the cervical rates or survival rates for cervical cancer of Black women is still the same as it was in the 1970s. It just so happens that medical science has progressed, but there's something else that's at play that causes this population to not have access to it. So this whole narrative that somehow these folks just aren't invested or it's personal responsibility, I want to give you an example. You know about the Tuskegee experiment. Everybody knows about that. Black men injected with syphilis, okay? Shortly after that time period, there's the case of Henrietta Lacks, which they recently made a story about. In that case, she goes into Johns Hopkins to be able to get treated for cervical cancer, and they illegally obtain part of her DNA that goes on to be the source of the HeLa cells line, the first immortalized human cell line that led to many medical breakthroughs, and we're still using that cell line now. Now you ask yourself, why would Black folks not trust medical science? There's a history of it. I'd say in closing, race has impeded our ability to address the pandemic. And keep in mind, we're not just talking about the Tuskegee experiment or even diabetic rates. The same challenge is going to impact who has access to the vaccines and who feels comfortable taking the vaccine. There's a reason why. In the end, healthcare professionals trained at historically Black colleges and universities are critical because not only do they know the science, but they also understand the community. They were trained in the community, their schools are in the communities, and they're culturally responsive in how not just the science, but the engagement with the people is so critically important. So here's the challenge I would say. We could talk to folks at the medical schools at Meharry or at Morehouse, and they can tell us things about the way that we need to think about reaching out to the community. But in this case, I think it's critical that we have individuals trained in those communities come to majority white institutions and talk to them about the science isn't enough. You've got to be able to build meaningful relationships and build from the wisdom that emanates in those communities. It's a proven commodity and they're critically needed. Thank you. And now I'll turn it back over to our moderator, Steve Beck.
Roland, thank you so much for that. That's a really insightful, and it's already generated some questions. So we'll get to that at the end, but that's really great. If we can go to the next slide, I believe our next speaker is Dr. Stamps. So Dr. Stamps, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I assume that everyone can hear me. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to take part in this panel. I have to admit, I'm slightly nervous because I am marching among giants in the field, but I am excited to be here and excited to share with you all my research. So as you can see in the slide, my research is really positioned in understanding the role of identity and the ways in which individuals cope and ideally survive and thrive within different spaces. And I am explicitly interested in the ways in which Black folks survive and thrive in spaces. And so I'm going to share with you a couple of my projects and then kind of wrap up very soon, I promise, on a project I'm working on right now that I'm very excited about, and it is closely aligned with our work here. We talk about race in the pandemic. And so again, as I mentioned, my research is really situated in how individuals in different systems are surviving. And so one of the initial projects that I published in 2020 in March look at the ways in which Black male characters exist in television and how they are starting to push back against the historical narrative of Black males as being criminal or deviant, and demonstrating ways in which they are more loving, demonstrating more social support, aware of mental health, and moving forward, able to express a very genuineness when it comes to the spectrum of masculinity. And so I make an argument that those depictions not only allow for Black men to see themselves in rich portrayals, but also touch on an interracial and an interracial dynamic, meaning that as we see ourselves, we understand the full breadth of who we can be, but as others see us in different modalities, in different spaces, they also get a chance to broaden their horizons about who Black people are in society and who Black people are in different social spaces. The next piece that I want to mention very briefly, which was just published a few weeks ago, also looks at ways in which Black folks are surviving and thriving in different spaces. And here I look at the role of media literacy. And so this idea that different audiences understand what's coming at them from their television sets and from their laptops and from their smartphones, and can actually differentiate the ways in which systems operate, and they can understand fake news from truth, they can understand different hierarchies, and because of that skill set, can preserve their individual esteem, their group esteem, and again, arguably thrive within spaces that we all know historically, and Dean Mitchell mentioned this, have vilified and attempted to erase certain groups, and explicitly Black Americans. And then the third and final project I want to touch on that is really kind of interwoven into our conversation today is tentatively titled piece called Black and Essential. And so I'm really excited about this project. It's going on right now. So I'm going to excitedly share with you some of the findings that have kind of come out of the pilot study. This particular project is looking at Black populations across the US, across the state of Louisiana, and right here in Baton Rouge. There's several different grants that are kind of flowing in. One from E Pluribus Unum Institute, which was founded by Mitch Landrieu, a former mayor of New Orleans. And what these projects are looking at, again, going back to my research, is the ways in which Black folks in the midst of the pandemic are thriving in spite of the narratives that exist. And so I'm really excited about this project because what it looks at is two-pronged. One, demonstrates that consumption of news, while it may exacerbate the worry that we get from watching the news, watching numbers go up and down, there's also different coping mechanisms, from active coping and emotional coping, demonstrating that Black people across the US are seeking out social support, are talking to their medical providers, and are understanding how to navigate society. They're wearing masks, they're social distancing, and this is important to note because the narrative typically frames Black people and arguably a lot of minorities as less than or from a deficit framework. We know right now that 40% of essential workers are Black people and 70% are people of color, and that people of color are twice as likely to lose their job in the midst of the pandemic than their white counterparts. So folks are hit hard. That I am not trying to negate that. But what I want to have is a conversation about the ways in which we are surviving this and are thriving in spite of. And so the research on one hand looks at that narrative. The other part of the narrative that I'm really excited about is attempting to bring those voices that are arguably vilified and missing from the conversation to the actual spaces where policies are being implemented and programs are being exercised. And so this program is asking Black folks across the US, across state of Louisiana, and across Baton Rouge, what are your expectations from policymakers? What are your expectations from different programs that are going to be implemented? We know right now that the issues that are hurting different communities, but specifically Black communities, existed well before COVID-19. And so whether it's living in food deserts or access to healthcare or just different disparities when it comes to education and the digital divide, they were here back in February of 2018. So this is not new conversations, but now that it's at the forefront of different individuals who were privileged enough to not have to exercise any care or compassion, now that it's here, we need to have a rich conversation of how do we attenuate these things. And so the Black and Essential Project asks Black essential workers, Black folks across the country and in our state, what are your expectations? What do you need? And the nice thing is folks are willing to share. When people are given the opportunity and agency, they'll tell you what their expectations are. No one has to guess, and no one has to take their lived experience and force it upon someone else. And so whether it is more transportation, better communication, more empathy, more funds, we're bringing in this information, this data, and hopefully taking it to policymakers and folks who have a little bit of opportunity to really enact some real change. So we can start to close the wealth gap, the knowledge gap, the digital divide. So whatever comes at us next, after this pandemic ends, fingers crossed soon, we can see more equitable distribution, and we can see more agency offered to communities that are often vilified and on the sidelines when it comes to important conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Stamps. That was really, that was wonderful. And now it is time for Dr. Martin. If I can, there we go. Dr. Martin.
Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to everyone who took the time out to join us for this discussion. So I want to talk a little bit about a book that I completed. It won't be out until May 2021, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why I decided to write the book and why I think it's important. And I'll say one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book goes to points that Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Stamps have already made about racial disparities. And so, you know, I am concerned, as many of you are concerned, about ongoing racial disparities, especially between Black and white people in America, and issues related to wealth, as Dr. Stamps mentioned, also in the criminal justice system, in the educational system, and as it relates to health and healthcare, for instance. And so not only am I concerned about these racial disparities, but I'm also concerned about those policymakers that Dr. Stamps mentioned. Many of them have favored race-fair or race-neutral solutions for dealing with ongoing racial disparities. And what's even more problematic for me is that in recent years, some Black scholars as well as some Black elected officials have joined in this movement. And while in the past they have advocated for race-centered solutions, increasingly in the last few years, some have been advocating for universal or what they call race-neutral or race-fair strategies. And some of the reasons that they give for doing this is that it's not politically feasible to really center race. And I would argue, as other people have argued in the past, that when it comes to challenging the oppressors about, you know, oppressing people, that there really is never a politically feasible time. And so, so that's problematic. And I was also, in terms of trying to explain why this might be the case, why there's this great emphasis, and some might argue increased emphasis on race-fair and race-neutral policies, is the fear of what some might call white backlash. And this is not a new concept. People like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was writing about this during the modern civil rights movement. But we also are seeing, as we can tell from one of the images on my slide, an uptick in some of this overt backlash from members of the dominant racial group in America. And so in the book, I talk a bit about COVID-19, and again, talking about these disparities. Dr. Stamps talked about essential workers and how Black people and other people of color are overrepresented among them. We can also look at the COVID-related deaths. In some cities, you know, over 70% of the COVID-related deaths were of Black people. And so there were efforts to try and, to quote a phrase that many of us remember hearing, flatten the curve, not just because Black people were dying, but because of a whole host of issues. And then that was followed, as we all remember, by a patchwork of stay-at-home orders. This picture from the left is a response to those orders and challenges to those orders in the state of Michigan. And the media, and as well as from the White House, tried to frame it as a constitutional issue. We had the president tweeting about liberating these places. We had the media and some of the protesters even arguing that this was about their amendment, about their First and Second Amendment rights. But what I argue in the book is that perhaps we can best understand this white backlash using a concept that is not as used as much as I think it should be used in sociology, and that is looking at American civil religion. And American civil religion, some scholars have argued in the past, should be treated like any other religion and studied with the same type of rigor, and that it could be defined as the beliefs and the symbols and the rituals that many Americans share. And I would say that we're talking specifically about white Americans. Another thing that I try to add to this conversation about understanding this backlash and protests regarding the stay-at-home orders is to look at whiteness as religious. And again, not a new idea. Du Bois was talking about this in 1918. And I, along with some of my colleagues, Dr. Stephen Finley and Dr. Biko Gray, have extended that to understand what's happening in the current situation in which we're living. And then lastly, I'll say it's also informative to look at the state response to various protests. And so if we look at this one picture in Michigan where individuals, mostly white men, are protesting the stay-at-home orders, we can see one response from law enforcement. And then when we look at these, what some have called the George Floyd uprisings, we see a very different response to that form of protest. And so I think it's important, if we're serious about addressing ongoing racial disparities as they relate to the current pandemic or in any other area of American society, that we really have to center race, and we have to expand and understand what racism really is. And that is not just a belief system, it's not just examples of prejudice and microaggressions, but racism is a multi-level and multi-dimensional system of oppression. And so that's what I did in this book, American Denial, and I look forward to a conversation with everyone in attendance. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's now time for a question and answer. And if I can get everybody unmuted, and Dr. Martin, I think, is there. There we go. Not quite. Okay, so thank you all for a really stimulating set of presentations. We do have a question right from the top. It's addressed to Dr. Mitchell, but I think all three of you, I'd really like to hear your opinions on this. In what ways does the stress of being an African-American professor and scholar, especially at a predominantly white institution, parallel both the creativity that results from confinement and the health problems? And the person is asking specifically about the racial battle fatigue, but even beyond that. So Dr. Mitchell.
Sure. First of all, the question from Dr. Stephen Finley, in a lot of ways, Dr. Finley is probably better suited to answer this question than anybody. Brilliant scholar has written about, thought about, asked the hard questions, and done the advising. I'll take a stab, but I'd also appreciate recognizing that my colleagues, as well as Dr. Finley, are well suited to help us think through this. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go back to a sociologist, Patricia Hill Collins, well known, written a lot. She writes about being an outsider within. Part of being an outsider within means that as an academic at a PWI, and I mean, I have to say as a full professor and as a dean, I'm an insider in the sense that there's certain institutional power. I understand the way that the place works, but at the same time, by virtue of being an African-American, particularly a Black man, there's still an outsiderness that you literally come to work, you're part of conversations on a regular basis, that you understand a part of your academic field, but you're also greatly concerned. So let me give you some characteristics that you'll see. And this typically is read somehow as just some kind of single black person who's being kind and congenial or just a nice guy, but it's not nice guy. So let me give you an example. You'll watch black professionals pay very close attention to the facilities folks. The reason why is because the separation between whatever perceived position that you've gotten from the university and the people that are part of your community, you know that your grandmother, who may not have had an opportunity to be on campus, knows just as much, knows more, and provides an insight that's critically important to moving through that campus. What that means is you bring with you an understanding of the institution by being in a lot of ways based on your race, potentially your faith commitments, your sexuality, that makes you an outsider to the mainstream. So you see the place with different eyes than people that were basically socialized within and have full access. What that translates into is you're constantly looking for spaces of support, but also recognizing that as an insider, you get the place, but you see it differently. So part of what that does is it provides these relationships where you'll see, we're sitting in meetings talking about how is COVID going to affect the campus? How does it impact who's on campus? And you're desperately concerned if there's a budget cut. Guess what? The first people that are going to be cut, for the most part, look like you. And you have significant concerns about that. That's an outsider, but also an insider perspective. In my opinion, if the university does what it's supposed to do, it listens very closely to those insights and understandings because they help you better understand the limitations of what the university is. Now, as it relates to, it causes there to be relationships between, say, black students. Black faculty are notorious for having high advising loads and even advising in places that may not necessarily be their students, but they're terrified that they will not get the same kind of service, they will not be treated well, and in some cases, people just don't know how to build connections with them to hold them accountable, but also to coach them up at times when they do need a little extra help. I'll give you an example. One of the things that I found with black students is, what I appreciate about black students is, I never have to have a conversation with them about life isn't fair. That's never a conversation. There's an inherent criticality to the way that they see the world that as an academic that's gold to me. I can teach you the kind of background or whatever the theories is we can read, but to teach you to inherently be critical of and to provide that perspective is gold. Now, but also the health problems comes in, that desire to provide service beyond the scope of what would typically be your responsibilities from the institution translates into over-advising, overworking, constantly being in an environment where you're looking at ugly things. You constantly are in a place where you know it's not right, and you have to choose when you want to push, when you want to speak, when you want to step back. That right there, that translates into what William Smith, who coined the phrase racial battle fatigue, talks about, the mental, physical, and ultimately psychological stress that black people working in white environments are constantly juggling. They're constantly making the move. There are different ways that you can choose to move in that space, but not being able to fully be yourself and just basically, quote unquote, do your job, whatever that means, as a higher level of stress that's just so difficult that you see. The other thing that I want to close also with is, I guarantee you, black women in this space experience this different than black men do. It's not the same. There's no unified way that it's encountered, but the way that I personally watched it, black women have been chewed up by this place. They have not been represented or treated the way that they should be. And I think that there's something about the institution that lacking that kind of outsider, insider perspective causes you to assume somehow it has something to do with personal responsibility. Well, if you just had this conversation, if you just went to HR, no. The institution is wired in such a way that certain bodies are valued in different ways than others.
Thank you. Dr. Martin, I'd really like your perspective on the same question.
Sure. Well, first I'd like to thank Reed Darcy with the Reveille for doing an article on this very subject. And if you all haven't read it, I would invite you to do a search and to check it out. And it features the voices of several Black professors at LSU. And I would echo much of what Roland said. and to note that, I oftentimes tell my graduate students, and I'm surprised that this is one of the things that they remember most in the advice that I give them during their time at LSU, and that is how to cope with the anger that they sometimes feel at what they experience within their departments, what they experience across the university, what they experience in their disciplines. And I tell them, don't get angry, right? And so I try to support Black women graduate students in particular in trying to channel their emotions and the anger that they feel so that they can be productive and move towards their goals of completing their degrees and impacting their fields, and also impacting our disciplines and the community as a whole. So it is quite challenging. And, again, to echo something that Dean Mitchell said, it's important to find spaces where you are supported. And so, for example, I find that in African and African American studies, which is a very diverse program to be major, where people can share their work, where they're celebrated for their work, where they're honored for their service. And so we need to, I think, invest in places like that are really important towards the retention of not only students, but also of Black faculty and of Black staff as well. And, I also appreciate when I have allies within my department. I've shouted her out before. People like Dr. Sarah Becker is wonderful. And so it's great when you have allies who understand or try the best they can to understand what you're going through and to try to be supportive of you. And I will also say, I appreciate when you have people like the dean of our college at HSS, who in trying to respond to the killing of George Floyd, did not just issue a statement on behalf of the college, but he reached out to Black professors in the college, asked for input, incorporated that input, and then shared it with the broader community, and has demonstrated a commitment to diversity and inclusion going forward. So I think that we can't underestimate the role and importance of Black professors at PWIs, including at LSU. It's so critical that we're at the table to change the conversations that frankly would not even happen if we weren't there. And we offer so many added benefits that don't appear on annual reports and you never see on a CV. And it's also critical to recognize that individuals like those who are on the panel are experts in their field. They're experts in race. And so we should look to them when we want to have conversations such as the one that we're having this evening. And for that, I really appreciate everyone involved with the Science Cafe for doing this.
Thank you. Dr. Stamps, as a relatively junior member of our faculty, what is your perspective on this?
I guess, so I'm going to answer this and be very transparent. So I, the late but great John Lewis said that when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something, you have to do something. And as a first generation, lower class Black kid who was born and raised in Ferguson, Missouri, who has tattoos up and down his arm, I exist in spaces where I rarely see anyone like me. And like Dean Martin said, as an outsider on the inside, I am constantly listening to narratives that continue to vilify folks who look like me, folks who have lived experiences similar to mine. And it is my job to say something and to call that out and to speak to that question, which means there's constant stress and constant health implications because of that. And so just to be transparent, it's hair loss, it's weight gain, it's imposter syndrome. And the reality is I don't know any different because I wish there was someone who looked like me in rooms before I got there who said something so that it wouldn't be this hard for me. And so just to talk about that question from its foundation, my reality is I get one shot. If I sit in a room and I'm silent, I am complicit to the continued vilification and demonization of folks who look like me. And that is all up and down the campus. So I'm talking about my colleagues, administrators, our janitorial staff. All of us are unique and special. All of us bring something rich to this space, but all of us are not respected the same way. And so, as Lewis said way better than I ever could, it is my job to say something. And the reality is that will come with the headaches and the hair loss and the weight gain and the imposter syndrome that is constantly surfacing all the time. And I also know I have to work twice as hard to just be considered half as good as everyone else in the room. So to answer Dr. Finley's question, it's real. And I don't have an answer how to get around it. It's just my truth. I'm the only Black male in my program. I was the only Black male in my PhD program, the only Black male in my master's program. I've never had a Black male professor before. This is it. If I don't do it, I don't know if it'll be done any other way. And so the reality is those health patients are going to come with it. But maybe the next person who's on this Zoom right now will have a different narrative because someone called it out when they had the opportunity.
We have a wonderful, thank you, Dr. Stamps. We have a wonderful question from Frida Dunn that I'd like to pose to you. As a 68-year-old white female raised in Baton Rouge and teaching at LSU, the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 was the very beginning of my high school years. My early years were very white, and I didn't really start to recognize white privilege until after high school. Fast forward, I incorrectly thought my friends, classmates, and myself had moved past the things our parents and grandparents taught us. Recent conversations last week have stunned me into seeing a sea of women very anxious to protect that Southern heritage white women of my age were indoctrinated in. I don't know how to have conversations with them anymore, and I even worry if some of my early years are still with me. And I'd really like to get your response to that. Dr. Mitchell.
Okay, well, can I do this? Also, in addition to that, we have a question from Robert Demph. How can we have better and more meaningful conversations between LSU leadership, faculty, students of color to affect change? And I think that my answer overlaps to both of those questions.
And these questions do overlap, yes.
So the first thing that I would say is honesty matters. It matters, it matters, it matters. The other thing that I like to argue is our space, the beauty of being at a university is at the end of the day, we're all educators. So this is a pedagogical space where you learn those conversations. Now here's what's hard, okay? So this is constantly, this is somewhat owing to critical race theory. The sad part about the conversation is that race and racism and injustice are constants in society. One of the constants that you see in human histories is that we're nothing nice, okay? So this idea that we think that there's gonna be a silver bullet or that we reached a moment, we had a president, we had a conversation, I married a person of, no. Guess what? Race and racism lives with us. Think of it like a living entity. Matter of fact, think of it like the D in Honda diabetes. It's a chronic condition that I'd argue will mutate and change to continue to exist. Also, we're all breathing it. So I would argue that just like there are, and I mean, Dr. Stamps is better able to speak to this than anybody, but the media representation and the lack of representation by people of color means that we actually have imbibed certain conversations about Black people and dislike of Blackness within the Black community as well. So for my colleagues that are, the first question, now we never get away from it. And that's the beauty of a conversation about anti-racism, because race and racism in particular is like a living body that will do anything that it can to mutate, to continue to live. So we have to be just as active, if it's a chronic condition, to figure out what we can do to inoculate ourselves against it. I think the first step that I've already watched LSU leadership do to start to approach that is to take seriously the conversations that our students have to tell us about our institution, and particularly our students of color. Listen to them. They're brilliant. I have them in class all the time. And I tell you what, I walk into most of my classes and I am very clear as an academic, I am not the smartest person in the room. Just because you have the credential does not mean that you're the smartest person in the room. And I'd argue that as a faculty member, you don't need to be. You need to guide the learning. You need to be open, create a space where the conversation happens. And I'd argue that what LSU leadership has already started to do is to take serious, to listen. Listen to the students, trust them. They're brilliant. I've already seen it. Recognize that brilliance comes in a lot of different bodies, a lot of different shapes. And then once you've taken the step to listen, and this is what's difficult, we've all been raised on this whole idea that the golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated. And that seems like such a great idea. I'd argue, how about taking the time to learn how people want to be treated and then build a meaningful relationship with them? The other thing that I like to argue that our leadership, as well as white folks that are willing to work in communities of color, this is the hard part. This is gonna sound bad, but it drives me crazy when I hear stories about Black folks, and particularly Black men, need to be mentored. No, there's no way that you can have a different perspective. If George Floyd would have had a different perspective, that would have not changed his fate. There's a lack of the ability to see the humanity in people that do not look like you. So my argument would be, they don't need to be mentored anymore. They don't need, white folks may need to be mentored by people of color that they're in community with to figure out how to recognize the humanity in that community. That's the hard part of being an academic. We think we know everything. The students are mentoring us on how our institution can better provide service to them. That's the key. That's the key. Be open, set aside our degrees, set aside our age, set aside all of that, and take the time to recognize that what they're saying, whether we agree or not, is legitimate understanding. Once you really have a full understanding of that and you're willing to be in community, there isn't going to be a magic bullet, but I bet that as you start to build your relationships based on the wisdom and insights of communities that we've typically overlooked, that translates into us starting to build a meaningful relationship to inoculate us against the ongoing onslaught of race, racism, and injustice.
I'd like to add to that with the first question, kind of couched it within the framework of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I'd just like to remind folks that there was at least one Civil Rights Act before that. And what we find happens with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is that you add other groups into it, other protected groups, which is fine. So adding gender, for example, and adding other groups is important. But what sometimes happens is when we start talking about issues about inclusion and about belonging, is we start to lump all these groups together. And even when we talk about people of color, we're ignoring the unique experiences of Black people relative to other non-white people. So we have to, kind of be cautious when we do that. And I will say, you can read the work that I've done previously to see what I think about race and about sports. But I would applaud, for example, the athletic department at LSU, who established a athletic leadership council on diversity and inclusion, and recognizes that there are all these groups that are critically important, that military veterans matter, that women matter, that people with disabilities matter. But in this moment, they've decided that they're going to focus on race. And there really is nothing wrong with doing that. But for some people, they see that as problematic. And so that can have an impact on the ability to really bring about change, because sometimes what you end up with is a lot of symbols and not a lot of substance. And so we just have to be cautious in thinking about moving forward.
Thank you. Dr. Stamps, a question that really any of the panelists can answer, but I'll hand it off to you from Dr. Finley. How do we talk about race such that it becomes an important public policy consideration, especially when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic and police brutality, such that we have a current leadership that denies that race is a factor in America?
It's a great question. To be honest, and to lean on the last comment you just mentioned, if you have to say race is not a factor, the truth is it is, because you had to bring it up. And so the red herrings have to be called out. When I talk to my students about understanding privilege and identities and things along those lines, I am fully aware that race for a lot of individuals can be a trigger word, and they're not sure how to exercise that uncertainty. And so I choose different identities to kind of get the conversation started so they can understand the ways in which race is also interwoven into our day-to-day existence. And so when I talk to individuals, I talk about being able-bodied. What does it mean to not have to worry about a ramp or having to be able to access different rooms and open doors and get across campus? And all of a sudden, people's heart break because they see the inequity. They see the lack of access. And the same thing is applied to gender and sexuality and religion and race. But I had to start at a space where people can walk in and realize I don't have to be defensive. And so when we talk about policies, when we talk about inequities, we have to talk about different identities, because for some folks, not many who are probably on my screen right now, race doesn't seem to be applicable because there is a history with that people have to just understand and unpack. And sometimes we have to go around it to make sure that we can really help understand the ways in which it affects us. I'll give you a random example and I'll be super short. I had a class with mostly white men who were conservative. This is not here in Baton Rouge, but in a different institution. And I knew when we talked about privilege and unpacking privilege, it was going to be an uphill battle. And so we went outside the classroom and I asked all of my students, majority male, majority white, majority conservative, because of the location I was in, how would a person in a wheelchair get to the cafeteria? I knew how the lay of the actual campus, and the ramp was about 50 feet in one direction, and it wrapped around where it would take almost 20 minutes for someone to get us some fries. And so the students' heart broke because they saw the inequity. They saw the additional barriers. They saw how unfair it was that if you weren't able-bodied, it would take you 5 times as long to be able to get a Coke. And I was like, now let's apply that to mass incarceration. Let's apply that, let's talk about redlining. And all of a sudden, their eyes and ears were open. And so I hate to say that we have to do the extra work, but the reality is we have to do the extra work to find a way to make things applicable in different contexts so that we can have a rich, robust conversation. And so that's one way, and I'm sure there are many others, to start to understand how people's lived experiences and identities matter in various contexts. And they shouldn't be minimized because of some hierarchy or because of white supremacy.
Thank you.
Well, if I could, I would add that another strategy would be an example an initiative that's being pushed by some student athletes, and that is requiring that everyone at LSU, and this has happened at other institutions as well, actually take an African-American studies course, take a course on race where they can learn the things that they didn't learn in their previous experiences with education. And so it makes it a lot easier when the students walk into Dr. Stamp's classroom and they have a better understanding about their position in the world and how the racial group that they belong to impacts how they view the world and how the world views them.
This question just came up that applies directly to that from Mandalina Robinson. Our students, the story of race relations in the US is very important. However, that should be done much earlier. How can LSU help change the way our young children are taught this history in public schools?
And that's two things. I think on the one hand, we could make the course a course at LSU required of all students. And again, and in the African-American Studies program, we're already having conversations with Dr. Matt Lee. We're having conversations with the folks that handle dual enrollment so that we can begin the process of offering more African-American Studies courses in the high schools right now. I believe in EBR schools, there's only one high school that offers anything that resembles even a race class, and that has to change if we are to move forward on these issues.
You know, one of the things I'd like to add to that is the beauty of being on our campus and in Baton Rouge in general is it's all around us. I mean, my office is right outside the Indian Mounds. Telling that story, understanding why there's something unique in Louisiana about knowing how to pronounce Chapatulas, it's there, it's all over us. Everything from those canons that our first director that we never talk about for the university gave us after the Civil War, to even why the buildings are called what they're called. Even the murals in Allen Hall and the beautiful mural that was just done in Art and Design building. It's all over the campus. You literally cannot talk about it. I like to, you can't walk on this campus without understanding it. And not even, matter of fact, I say it like this. The oldest industry that the U.S. ever had was higher education. Harvard started in 1636 before there was a constitution. Harvard did not allow women nor African Americans. That's not it. And actually, initially, those early universities were started to supposedly Christianize the heathen population in the Americas. Before we even got here, we were making certain kind of cultural, ultimately racial claims about who we are. So it's embedded in who we are as a nation. And then by the time we get to the 1890 HBCUs that were founded through the Land Grant Act, the fact that somehow they're framed as racial dinosaurs, as opposed to all of the institutions were formed around a certain kind of racial elitism, but it just so happens that it gets dumped on the Southerns or the Fisk or the Xaviers or the Dillards. The racial thinking and ideas about race, racism, institutionalized racism are so much a part of who we are. And I mean, y'all have read the book. Charles Mills talks about it. Race is the single organizing theory in actually Western civilization that we haven't written about in a certain way, the way that it's structured who we are. So I'd argue it's already here. African and African American studies points it out. They speak to it. The folks in comp studies do a beautiful job at having that conversation. The folks in the Curriculum Theory Project talks about it. We have the experts, we have the resources. We could teach a whole class just on race here. We could do it. So it's here. It's a part of who we are. We just need to call it out and make it not just race as it relates to social theory, but I'd argue even the fact that there are low numbers of people of color, that's not true, low numbers of African Americans in STEM fields, that in and of itself has to do with a particular way that we think about race and racism. So the curriculum is here. We got it. We have the ability to teach it. We just need to forward it.
I have a question from Derek Roveras. Dr. Martin, could you speak to the anticipated white lash both nationally and we have students back on campus in Baton Rouge?
So the question is about white backlash on campus?
I think so, yes.
Okay, so I think that it should be anticipated. I think it should also be anticipated that not only at LSU, but at universities and colleges across the country, that there's going to be an uptick in Black students and students from other groups that are supportive of them in pressing institutions to do more than just issue statements and change names on buildings. And so we've had a lot of engagement over the summer with some groups who have been identified oftentimes by administrators as so-called Black student leaders, but we haven't really talked to the masses of Black students who will be on campus soon. And we can also see here at LSU and other places that Black student athletes are also organizing and demanding to be part of the conversation. And so I don't think that we have seen the end of these discussions and dialogues about how to move forward. And there's going to be backlash. I'm a firm believer in what Derek Bell called racial realism, and that you have these peaks of progress and then you're back to business as usual. And so we should expect no less at LSU, but we should do everything that we can to try to create the kind of environment where we can not only have conversations, but we can actually make sure that the resources go to where they need to go so that we could bring about the change that we desire to see. So
we are coming up on the top hour. We have a couple of really great questions that I'd like to get answered. And so if it's okay with the panelists, can we run a little long on our program today? That would be great. So we have a great question from Mark Benfield about the concept of flattening the curve to eliminate police violence on African Americans. It's a fascinating idea. It brings a scientific perspective to the problem posed by pandemics. Do any of our panelists have some ideas about how we get this concept to gain more traction with the general population? The idea of flattening the curve of both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of police violence.
I can take a stab at that. So I think the current conversations that Black Lives Matter grassroots and nonprofit organizations are having around redistribution of funds and defunding the police is looking to exactly to flatten the curve of police violence. If you think about it from a macro space, if we redirect funds towards addressing homelessness and mental health, that actually, and send the appropriate parties when those issues arise, that would ideally curb or flatten this idea of aggressive police tactics. Because the reality is, a lot of police, and I have family who are police officers, aren't necessarily trained to deal with someone who may be dealing with a mental health issue. And so if you are trained, explicitly trained to ideally de-escalate, a turbulent issue, but that's not what this is, and you use those tactics, the outcome is inevitable. And so sending the appropriate parties there and making sure those appropriate parties have the right amount of funding so they can actually step up and help could ideally, for lack of better words, flatten the curve. And so it's a great question. And so the conversations are happening right now, and where we're putting our money, where are we putting our resources, and how do we look at policing in a very broad space? The truth is, my personal feeling is, police have a specific job, and arguably they've been pushed to do way more than they're trained to do. A lot of us are. A lot of us are asked to do things that we don't actually have the training to do. And it's upon us to say, that's not necessarily my lane. We need to find someone more appropriate. But the reality is, that's not something we always do. And so the nudge is, we need to redirect resources, redirect finances, have a really robust, rich conversation about who we send out on a call, depending on the issue at hand, so it can actually be mitigated appropriately. I think if that moves forward, we would see this quote unquote flattening of the curve when it comes to police brutality towards communities of color.
So I do think it's important to consider, how resources are allocated and what law enforcement is asked to do. But I really think the real important point in this issue is still looking at anti-Black sentiment. Because if we look historically, the police departments haven't always had the access to military equipment and so forth that they have now, that is oftentimes used against Black communities. But this history of hyper-surveillance and the criminalization of Black people goes back, and it has a lifespan that's much longer than some of the issues we're talking about in terms of funding the police. And it helps to explain why, when you have something like the killing of Alton Sterling, or even with the killing of George Floyd, that you have some people who gravitate towards Black Lives Matters and other people who want to say Blue Lives Matters and All Lives Matters. And that really is about understanding race and about a history of anti-Blackness. And that really is what's driving our inability, if you will, to so-called flatten the curve in policing and the killing of Black men and women and children.
This is a difficult question, and I think that Drs. Martin and Stamps have covered it. So the thing I would like to add to it, though, is this whole idea about not wanting to have a conversation about systemic or the relationships that cause these issues to occur. I just say, as a person who, works in the School of Education, we know that schools are financed through property taxes. If you live in a poor neighborhood, then you're more likely to go to a school that's underfunded. That translates into basically we also know that those same schools tend to have police much more present there. The data tells us that the earlier you have contact with law enforcement in a negative way, the more likely it is that you'll end up in prison down the road. And a lot of the students that we work with, literally where this comes from is they meet the school resource officer who's being asked to do something because the guidance counselors, the teachers, and the administrators are stressed where they really can't manage what's happening. So they end up having the police department serve a certain kind of function that they really were never intended to serve. So long before we get to the point where we're talking about incarceration, we have young Black children, and particularly young Black boys that have been adultified, they end up having contact that they should have never had in schools that leads them down the road. Now, I can tell you personally, and this just broke my heart. Before I worked in university settings, I was a alcohol and substance abuse counselor in metropolitan Davidson County, Nashville schools. I worked specifically with students who have been zero tolerance out of school. And it just so happened that one of the schools I work with had students that have been zero tolerance out because they had some kind of drug offense, okay? Then the other school had students that have been zero tolerance out because they had brought a weapon to school, had some kind of violent altercation, so they were kicked out. Now go figure. We know that Black kids use drugs and that white kids can be violent just like Black kids can. But it just so happened that my school, where the majority of the students have been zero tolerance out because of drugs, was for the most part an all-white school. And my school, for the kids that have been kicked out because of violence, was mostly an all-black school. We know that both populations struggle in certain ways, but we've chosen to criminalize them and treat them in different ways. And the thing that was even more painful is my school that had a majority white population, the youngest students were in about 7th grade, but the school that was majority black, that had supposedly students that had been violent, I had a baby in my class, I had a baby that I was working with that was 5 years old. Why do you put handcuffs on a 5-year-old? Why does that happen? Why did that little boy experience that? I can tell you what the little boy did is he mirrored what he saw violence in his own home. And the principal thought somehow by bringing the police out and getting tough with this kid and putting him in handcuffs, even though the handcuffs didn't fit the kid, was somehow teaching him a lesson. There's something else that's going on, and I think it goes back to the way that we think about race, the way that we historicize it, and it just didn't start at this moment, that I think leads to this kind of flattening the curve conversation. But to not see it institutionally means you're missing the full picture of how this thing is played out. And I mean, I think, like I said, I think Dr. Stamps and Dr. Martin spoke to it directly, but it's not just about flattening the curve. There are other things that get us to this point.
That brings us really to kind of the question I wanted to end on. And I'm summarizing a group of questions that have come up that deal with what do we do next? And by we, I mean specifically we as in those of us who are non-Black, persons of color, or white. What can we do? How do we engage the world around us to address these issues in the way that we can do? Obviously, we don't fully understand the Black experience, and we would appreciate any kind of feedback as to how we can engage our communities, our institutions to help start addressing this issue.
I would say at LSU and at other institutions that you have some really great assets right on campus, people who have made the study of race their life work. And so I think you should reach out to those folks and to draw on their expertise. And then for everyone more broadly, I like to just reiterate that activism comes in many forms. And so, you know, some people might put on a mask and take to the street with signs and engage in various protests to draw attention to some social issues. Other people may decide to join a group where they're sharing their experiences and trying to become educated about the history of race relations in America, and invite people like those of the individuals that are on this panel to help to educate them. Other people will donate resources. They'll donate resources to community-based organizations that are doing great work. They might donate to area studies programs like African and African American studies so that they can continue to do the great work. So there's lots of places where people can help and grow, as they say, where they're planted, and to use their talents and resources to help to bring about change. But again, at institutions like LSU and across the country, we really need to, you know, draw from the assets that are on our own campuses.
You know, I want to follow up. I can tell you personally, when I was in grad school, my major professor was a white guy. And I wrote my whole dissertation about how race impacts the way you think about your discipline. And one of the things that he told me that was so meaningful, that ties right into what Dr. Martin is saying, that I think about quite a bit, is as I was building my committee, one of the faculty members was a guy named Amilcar Shabazz. Dr. Shabazz was at the University of Alabama at the time, has gone on to do amazing things at the University of Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken. But one of the things that Dr. Rosick, my major professor, shared with me is, I can teach you a lot about being a brilliant scholar, but I cannot teach you how to be a brilliant scholar navigating a white space. What Jerry did that was so important to me is he knew what he knew, but he also knew the limitations of his knowledge. And just like I said, that it's important to know how you need to be mentored, he had the type of relationship with Dr. Shabazz where they could have the hard conversations. But he also knew that as he was building a community for me, you have to have people that have had similar experiences, that can speak truth to it and tap into it. So, I mean, literally, build meaningful relationships with folks, in this case, Dr. Shabazz, who may not be just like you. And in those meaningful relationships, be willing to have the hard conversations. There's no easy way, but what you don't want is to show up with students and you're having conversations and you just be blown like, I've never heard that before. Why would you think that racism exists at LSU? No, if you've been in the conversations with colleagues and been open to be mentored by, even if you agree or don't agree with the position, it won't be new, and you'll understand that there's a reason why those positions are being taken. And then you can have a kind of engagement that's meaningful and allows you to grow and ultimately enhances the institution's ability to provide service to the students as well as to the professionals from underrepresented populations.
And I have, so I'll be super brief just to kind of piggyback on what Dr. Martin and Dean Mitchell suggested or what they laid out. For anyone who's interested, who's not Black and who wants to understand more and like Dr. Maya Angelou said, do better. When you know better, you do better. Right. Seek knowledge and seek community. Like it takes that effort. And so everyone here has produced and published amazing work to help understand the way that race and racism is interwoven throughout our society and the impact that it has on different groups. There are books from popular press. And so seek out that knowledge and understand that as you take it in, be self-reflective and really ask thoughtful questions. And then likewise, as everyone else has already said, seek community, find people that can actually help, like Dean Mitchell said, mentor you, answer your questions in a safe space, engage thoughtfully, push you, help refine you, correct you when you're wrong, and be comfortable in the discomfort of knowing that you don't know everything. But if you're seeking for some kind of reconciliation or some kind of equity, that is going to take some soul searching, and that's okay. But I would say seeking out knowledge and seeking out community would be two of the best actions you can take right now as we're in this space of really getting to a healthier place where we can all coexist and see one another fully and wholly.
Dr. Stamps, Dr. Martin, Dean Mitchell, I want to thank you personally for just an absolutely fabulous conversation. It's an important one that we have to have. And I know that we'll be having more of these conversations as time moves on. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everyone for being a part of this conversation. We'd like to thank the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs. They have a virtual event series this year on racism in the United States. We encourage you to look them up. Tonight's lucky winner for the WRKF drawing is Linda Anderson. WRKF will mail you the Science Friday beverage tumbler at the address that you provided. Thank you so much for coming. We hope that we will see you again next month on Tuesday, August 25th for another virtual Science Cafe talk, this time tracking extreme weather and hurricanes with Dr. Nan Walker of the LSU Earth Scan Lab, Dr. Jill Trepanier from the Department of Geography and Anthropology, and state climatologist Dr. Barry Kine. Thank you all very much for attending. Good night.